Part 3 left off with James Moore pleading guilty and receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that is all the family of Pamela Moss, that's all they wanted. They wanted to be able to know that the person who killed their daughter, sister, loved one was in prison without any chance of ever getting out. Little did they know the battle they were about to enter for the next multiple decades. So let's get into that right now as I close out this final chapter of Pamela Moss's case. When James Moore pleaded guilty in 1963, he was sentenced under New York's former penal law, specifically the version that existed before September 1st, 1967. Under that sentencing framework, everyone involved, including Pamela Moss's family, prosecutors, and the court, understood that Moore would spend the rest of his life in prison. But in 1977, the New York legislature enacted Chapter 904 of the laws of 1977, creating Executive Law 259H. That statute applied to people serving life sentences under the old pre-1967 penal law, including those convicted of a first-degree murder under former Penal Law 1045 and 1045A, and that made them eligible to be considered for parole after serving 20 years. This understandably outraged Pamela's family and the community. In 1982, when Moore was in his late 40s, he had his first parole hearing. In his first 20 years behind bars, he became an accomplished painter, he earned college degrees, became Buddhist, and said he turned his life around. He also met his fiancée, a woman who was a former volunteer social worker at the prison. She was waiting for him to get out of prison so she could marry him, and she said that not only did she think so, but guards at the prison found him to be an exceptional, caring, and brilliant person. In 1982, Moore's parole was denied for the first time. The Moss family said they planned to work for legislation that would take away the right to a parole hearing for inmates like Moore. Moore responded by saying the family was only hurting themselves by hating him, and he urged their forgiveness. Every July, the community and Pamela's family would rally and petition the denial of Moore's parole. And I can just only imagine the exhaustion and mental bandwidth that must have taken. It's just so re-traumatizing, again and again and again. He was denied again in 84 and 86. In 88, he granted an interview with papers ahead of his hearing and pleaded for his second chance outside of prison. He said that the average killer spends 6 years in prison for murder, and that he had spent 26 already. He blamed the psychiatrist he met with in the early 60s for not committing him and said if he had been committed, Pamela Moss would still be alive. He talked about how he became a lay Buddhist monk, now had multiple degrees and was on his way to earning a doctorate, and said he was cured. Cured from what, you say? Well, because of his landscaping work. Moore said that he had been exposed to certain pesticides and herbicides that are now banned, and that there is scientific evidence that long-term intense exposure to these chemicals can impact the brain and nervous system, leading to things like tremors, seizures, and confusion. He argued that the chemical exposure contributed to his violence. In this 1988 article, he distanced himself from other sexual crimes he had stated he committed when he was first arrested in the 60s. Again, he was denied, but Pamela's family would have to relive these parole hearings 21 times every 2 years. And then, on his 21st parole hearing in the spring of 2022, James Moore was granted parole. At this point, he was 88 years old and was in exceedingly poor health, and he needed round-the-clock care. Having been in prison for just shy of 60 years, he became the longest-serving inmate in New York State history. By that point, he claimed to no longer remember the murder, but did still remember his belief that pesticides made him do whatever crime he was in prison for. But even with freedom granted, he never did get a moment outside of prison. For 2 years, every nursing facility either refused to take him or said they weren't equipped for his level of care, and he ended up dying in prison in 2024 at 90 years old. My heart goes out to the Moss family for enduring not only the loss of Pamela, but the decades-long battle to keep her killer behind bars. Some people feel sorry for James Moore and believe he was rehabilitated and should have been let out of prison, and talked about all his great accomplishments behind bars. But to that I say, the life he took, the beautiful 14-year-old girl, Pamela was never allowed that chance. She never got to go get college degrees or make art or have a family or any of that. It's just an absolute tragedy. Cases like Pamela Moss's are exactly why I started this podcast. We tend to romanticize the past and think that the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, that they were simpler, safer times. But when you really dig into the cases and those decades, you realize the reality was often very much different. Every Monday on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older cases like Pamela's, primarily unsolved ones, and we explore not only the crimes themselves, but how investigations have changed, how forensic science has advanced, and how many offenders were able to get away with crimes that would likely be solved today because of those tools. Simply, they just didn't exist back then. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to stick around. Follow A Simpler Time True Crime wherever you listen to your podcasts and dive into the more than 100 episodes dedicated to victims whose stories still deserve to be told.